Unlocking the Bible by David Pawson, Zephaniah. The Messenger, Chapter 1:1. The prophetic books focus more on the message than on the messenger, and this is never more true than with Zephaniah. We know very little about him. The only biographical details are in verse 1 of chapter 1, where we are told his name and his genealogy. The name Zephaniah in Hebrew is Zephaniah, which means hidden God. It is uncertain whether this means God has hidden himself, or if Zephaniah had been hidden by God. His genealogy gives us a clue, for he is the only prophet who traces his ancestry back 4 generations. Hezekiah, the last good king of Judah, see Isaiah 36-39, was his great-grandfather. So Zephaniah was of royal blood. During Manasseh's reign, royal offspring were being sacrificed to the god Molech under the king's direction, so it is my theory that Zephaniah was hidden by his mother, so that he would avoid the slaughter. Hence his very name is a reflection of God's preservation of him to be a prophet for the people. The genealogy gives us the era in which he lived and preached. Since the time of Hezekiah, the nation had drifted away from God. In addition to child sacrifice and the worship of Molech, Manasseh reinstated the phallic symbols and Asherah poles on the high ground and encouraged the people to go back to the fertility cults with their sexual overtones. The site for child sacrifice was Gehenna, a valley just south of Jerusalem, cursed by Jeremiah and used as a picture of hell by Jesus. Throughout the early years of Manasseh's reign, Isaiah tried to stop the decline in national morality and warned Manasseh of the dire consequences of his evil ways. But the king refused to listen and forbade Isaiah to preach, so that he had to write down his prophecies and circulate them in written form. Eventually, Manasseh ordered Isaiah's execution. That wasn't all, for Manasseh was also involved with astrology and spiritualist mediums, in further defiance of the law of God. This spiritual confusion led to moral chaos, for idolatry always leads to immorality. God's verdict on Manasseh in 2 Chronicles was that he was more evil than the original Canaanites, a staggering statement given that God had instructed his people to expel the Canaanites because of their corrupt lives. So we can imagine how God felt at this point. He had removed the evil Canaanites to make room for his holy people, and now they were worse than the people they had replaced. Manasseh died after reigning for 55 years and was succeeded by Ammon, a very weak character who did nothing to put the situation right, and Judah continued to slide. Ammon was assassinated after only 2 years on the throne. The whole nation was in moral chaos. Then an 8-year-old boy named Josiah became king, though the real ruler in the early years was Hilkiah, the high priest. With good and bad kings in his family tree, it was not clear who this boy king would follow: Hezekiah, his great-grandfather, or Manasseh, his grandfather. So God sent Zephaniah the prophet to prevent the nation from being exiled for their sin, as their northern brothers had been. The Message, Chapter 1, verse 2-3. The voice of prophecy had been silent for 70 years. Ever since the death of Hezekiah and the murder of Isaiah, there had been no word from God. So Zephaniah spoke into a vacuum with a very strong message. The prophecy has been called the compendium of all prophecy, because it includes so many elements also found in other prophets' work. His whole message revolved around the day of the Lord, which is mentioned 23 times in the prophecy. This day is not a 24-hour period, but means an era of time, as in the day of the horse and cart. It was a day of God's judgment, of putting things right, the day of the vindication of righteousness, when wrongs were righted and wickedness was punished. There is a parallel in the English calendar. Historically, there are 4 quarter days for settling accounts: Lady Day, 25th of March, Midsummer Day, 24th of June, Michaelmas Day, 29th of September, and Christmas Day, 25th of December. All accounts were examined, audited, and settled, and fraud was punished. They give us a picture of the day of the Lord. Zephaniah uses an interesting word to describe God's emotions. He says that God is irritated, though with none of the selfish petulance that humans exhibit. The day of the Lord is a day when God has had enough, and his anger boils over. There are 2 sorts of anger in the Bible. One is the inner anger that a person keeps inside and doesn't let out. It simmers away and is not obvious to other people. The other is the anger that erupts suddenly so that everyone knows. So it is this inner anger that is demonstrated in the book of Zephaniah. The prophet is saying that God's anger is simmering now, and the day of wrath will come when God can't hold it in any longer. Although simmering anger is often missed, the signs that God is angry can be seen. The symptoms of the simmering are there for all to see in a society going downhill. Compare Romans 1. But one day God's anger is going to boil over. We must put off this day by repenting and getting things put right. This is one of the themes of the prophecy. An outline of the book of Zephaniah. Foreign religion, chapter 1 verse 4 to chapter 2 verse 3. Deserved, chapter 1 verse 4 to 6. Declared, chapter 1 verse 7 to 9. Described, chapter 1 verse 10 to 16. Deflected, chapter 2 verse 1 to 3. Foredoomed regions, chapter 2 verse 4 to 15. The west, Philistia, chapter 2 4 to 7. The east, Moab and Ammon, chapter 2 verse 8 to 11. The south, Egypt and Ethiopia, chapter 2 verse 12, and the north, Assyria, chapter 2 verse 13 to 15. Future redemption, chapter 3 verse 1 to 20. Curses, divine justice, chapter 3 1 to 8. National obstinacy, chapter 3 1 to 7. Rebelling, chapter 3 1 to 4, and resisting, chapter 3 5 to 7. An international obliteration, chapter 3 verse 8. Blessings, divine mercy, chapter 3 verse 9 to 20. International godliness, chapter 3 verse 9. National gladness, chapter 3 10 to 20. Rejoicing, 3 verse 10 to 17. And returning, 3 verse 18 to 20. These 3 sections are very clear, but as is often the case, the chapter headings don't divide the book appropriately. Foreign religion, chapter 1 verse 4 to chapter 2 verse 3. In the first section, the prophet is concerned with the foreign religions which have become part of Judah's national life. He announces judgment and makes 4 basic statements about the day of the Lord that is coming. Deserved, chapter 1 verse 4 to 6. There had been considerable drift away from a proper relationship with God. Many had abandoned their allegiance to the God of Israel in favour of other gods. The priests who should have been ensuring that the covenant was kept were themselves leading people astray. Superstition was common, and many followed Manasseh's evil worship of Molech. Declared, chapter 1 6 to 9. Zephaniah describes what will happen to them when God judges them. When we read the prophetic books, we may feel we are reading exactly the same message, but God needs to repeat himself, especially as there have been 70 years between these words and his last ones. Zephaniah is warning the people that the day when the Lord will judge is coming very close. Described, chapter 1 verse 10 to 17. The judgment will be catastrophic for the people. They are largely complacent about their behaviour and how God feels about it. Zephaniah warns them that when the judgment comes, everyone will know. Deflected, chapter 2 verse 1 to 3. He then offers them the possibility that even at this stage, judgment can be deflected from Israel and turned away by repentance. It is the same message that all the prophets have. If they will humble themselves, God will hear and forgive and show them mercy in return. Indeed, the need for meekness is a key requirement in the prophets' messages. See Isaiah chapter 2 verse 9 and Micah 6 verse 8. Foredoomed regions, chapter 2 verse 4 to 15. Zephaniah addresses the nations threatening Judah from every point of the compass. On the west side of Judah was the land of Philistia, from which modern Palestine claims to be descended. On the east side were Moab and Ammon, and to the south were Egypt and Ethiopia. To the northeast was Assyria, the world power of the day, on the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Few nations were unaffected by the Assyrians. They had taken away the 10 tribes in the north. Babylon at this stage was still a small and insignificant power. Zephaniah is given a message that these nations will be judged by God. God is the judge of the whole world, and they will be judged for their attitude to Judah. But this interaction with Judah is a two-way one. Not only does God judge foreign nations for their attitude to Judah, but he also uses them to discipline Judah. We are told in the book of Amos that God brought the Philistines from Crete to inhabit the land west of Canaan at the same time as the children of Israel invaded Canaan. It is God who moves nations around and draws the map to dictate where people will be. So the Philistines became a real thorn in the side of Israel, right through to the time of King David, about 700 years later. Indeed, the name Philistine has become proverbial in the English language to describe someone who is hostile to other cultures. In Deuteronomy, God explains the situation. I've brought them to test you. If you keep my word, you will keep them at bay, and they will be no problem to you. But if you disobey me, I have brought them to be an instrument of discipline for you, and when you are doing wrong, they will overcome you. This action demonstrates God's concern. God is a father to his people, and a good father disciplines his children when they go wrong. In fact, Hebrews 12 says, if the Lord doesn't discipline you, then you are not a true son of God. This principle is not always grasped by Bible readers. If you become a child of God, then God will discipline you when you sin. But God does this so that you won't need to be punished after death. So Christians can expect life in this world to be tough. I can never believe the testimonies in which people claim that after they came to Jesus, all their troubles disappeared. I believed them once, but it depressed me, for my testimony was so different. I came to Jesus and my troubles began. When I was baptized in the Spirit, my troubles became even worse. I've been in more trouble in the last 5 years than in the previous 40, but I am glad, because it fits the promises of Jesus. He said, in the world you will have big troubles, but cheer up, I am on top of them. Future Redemption, chapter 3, 1-20. In the last section there is a strange tension between cursing and blessing. It is almost as if Zephaniah is saying, choose what you really want to have. Do you really want God's justice? He is full of mercy and wants to have mercy on us, but he can't give it without our cooperation, because he only gives to those who ask for it. I listen to many prayers for all kinds of things, but it thrills me to hear people ask for mercy, for they have understood a key law of the kingdom. We only ask for mercy if we think we are bad. If we think we are fine, we ask for health, strength, guidance, all sorts of things, but we never ask for mercy. Curses, Divine Justice, chapter 3, 1-8. A. National Obstinacy, chapter 3, 1-7. Rebelling, chapter 3, 1-4. In the first half of chapter 3, Zephaniah faces the people with the possibility of a day of divine justice when he tells them how obstinate they are. They have rebelled against God quite deliberately and are resistant to God's appeal. chapter 3, 5-7. He also accuses them of resistance. The rulers, officials, priests and prophets are all implicated. They are an obstinate people. A while ago, having read the verse in Zephaniah morning by morning, he dispenses justice, I composed a song of my own to the tune of the hymn, Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy righteousness, O God all holy. There is no error of judgment with thee. Thou changest not, thy commandments they fade not. As thou hast been, thou for ever wilt be. Great is thy righteousness, great is thy righteousness. Morning by morning thy justice I see. All that is merited, thou hast requited. Great is thy righteousness, Lord, hear our plea. We love to sing pleasant songs about God's positive attributes, such as faithfulness, but we need to accept that there is another side to God, and we need to be grateful for that too. Paul says in his letter to the Romans that we need to consider the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, providing you continue in his kindness. Zephaniah is telling the people that if they continue rebelling and resisting, there will be a national disaster. God's anger will boil over, and the day of the Lord will come. International obliteration, chapter 3, verse 8. What is true of God's anger towards Judah is also true of the whole world. He says that this same anger will boil over towards the nations and wipe them out. They will all stand before him, and the wicked will be consumed by his jealous anger. Blessings, Divine Mercy, chapter 3, verse 9-20. The book concludes with a note of hope, in common with many of the prophets. For example, Amos preached a message of God's justice as a penultimate prophet to the 10 tribes in the north before they disappeared. But the last word to the north was the prophecy of Hosea, a message of God's mercy and love. It is almost as if God's last word to us is, won't you have my mercy? Zephaniah finishes in the same way. God doesn't want to punish. He has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He wants to show mercy, and so finishes on a note of hope for the future. International Godliness, chapter 3, verse 9. His note of mercy for the nations is that out of every nation he would draw people who love him. We are told that people will come out of every kindred, tribe, tongue and nation. God doesn't want a single ethnic group on earth to be missed out. This is why he told us to preach the gospel to all ethnic groups and to make disciples of them. National Gladness, chapter 3, 10-20. But then he finishes up with the possibilities of blessing for Israel itself. 9 times in this last little section God says, I will. Judah may break his covenant, but he will never break it. Rejoicing, chapter 3, 10-17. In that day, no one will be proud or haughty. They will do no one wrong and tell no lies. No one will be able to make them afraid. He talks about a wonderful future when he will quiet them with his love. He even says God will sing about his people. He will rejoice over them with singing. Returning, chapter 3, verse 18-20. God will gather those who have been scattered and bring home a remnant who will revere his name. Though they have been despised, they will be exalted in the eyes of the world. God will give them praise and honour in every land where they were put to shame. So at the end of the book there is a note of extraordinary hope. God's people have the opportunity to be judged now and to get right with God now. Conclusion. We are left with one question about Zephaniah. Was Zephaniah's prophecy effective? Did Josiah take any notice? Josiah came to the throne at the age of 8 in 640 BC and reigned for 31 years. At first he was heavily influenced by the high priest Hilkiah, who tended to keep the status quo, but then he began to be influenced by Zephaniah. At the age of 16, he destroyed the altars in Jerusalem. At the age of 20, he ordered all the pagan altars to be destroyed throughout the whole country. At the age of 28, he noticed that the temple of God was in bad repair, and so he ordered it to be put right. While they did this, someone found a copy of the Law of Moses in an old dusty cupboard. They realized that they hadn't been studying it or reading it for years. When Josiah read it, he was horrified. He realized why God was warning them. So at the age of 28, he ordered the law to be read again and carried out throughout the nation. So the signs up to this point were good. But Josiah didn't realize that you can't make people good by an act of parliament. Many people today think that if only our government would pass good laws, then people would behave in a Christian way. But righteousness can't be imposed from above. It must be expressed from within, as God works in the human heart. Josiah's life ended following an ill-advised attack on the Egyptian army, who were passing through the Holy Land to attack Assyria. He was killed in the ensuing battle, despite being in disguise. So while having some influence, Zephaniah failed to turn the nation around. The people didn't listen, but his work was not wasted. There was a young man, the same age as Josiah, whom God told to pick up the prophetic burden. Jeremiah was charged with telling the people that the reform wasn't working and they needed to return to God. Making use of Zephaniah. The key application for the believer today concerns judgment. The day of judgment for the whole world will come after death. Judah's condemnation is a foretaste and foreshadowing of what will happen to the world. Jesus twice alludes to Zephaniah in connection with the second coming. See Matthew 13 verse 34 and Zephaniah 1:3, Matthew 24 verse 29 and Zephaniah 1:15. So most people will face God's wrath after Jesus returns. B. The day of judgment for God's people will come before it does for other people. 1 Peter 4:7 reads, "For it is time for judgment to begin with the family of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God?" Zephaniah is a powerful reminder for Christians that they should expect God's discipline but not lose heart. Discipline in this life is a sign of God's care and assures us that we won't be judged along with the world. Zephaniah and Revelation. In closing, we need to also note the remarkable correlation between the prophet Zephaniah and the outline of the book of Revelation. Both Zephaniah and Revelation start with judgment on God's people, Israel and the church respectively. They both move on to judgments on the nations, Zephaniah 2, Revelation 4-15. Finally, they move on to the day of judgment, Zephaniah 3, 1-8 and Revelation 20. But the last word is the final bliss of God's giving a place to his people where they can live forever, Zephaniah 3, 9-20, Revelation 21-22. In Zephaniah, the location is the Old Jerusalem, but in Revelation it is the New Jerusalem. In Zephaniah, God comes as king, but in Revelation, Jesus comes again as king. In all, there are over 400 allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, but the closest connection is with the prophet Zephaniah. So, a seemingly obscure Old Testament book is actually a central book for our understanding of the future.